0370 60 60 900 by texting SKY to 70150 to give £10, or by sending a cheque to this address. Just £10 provides essential hygiene supplies for one displaced person for a month. £50 means blankets for 10 homeless people in freezing temperatures. And £100 can provide emergency food for 2 families for a whole month. They need our help to survive. Please, donate now.
It is 7 o'clock. This is Sky News live from Lviv, Ukraine, with a special program on the Ukraine invasion on the 8th day of this conflict. Mariupol in southeast Ukraine is encircled and under siege from Russian invaders. The mayor of the city describes it as genocide. Russian forces advance into the southern city of Kherson, but both sides claim to have control. Russia is accused by Ukrainian ministers of war crimes, but Putin insists his campaign is going according to plan.
Special military operation is being conducted strictly in accordance to the plan and schedule.
United in defiance, hundreds of Ukrainian MPs meet in secret for just 10 minutes and sign off new laws to arm the resistance. Tens of thousands of refugees continue to stream into neighbouring countries. The UN says more than 1 million people have fled so far. Speeding up sanctions, new curbs to crack down on Russian oligarchs linked to President Putin. And good evening from Lviv in the west of Ukraine, just over a week on from the start of the Russian invasion. Life for the people of this country is getting more difficult. Cities in the south are being bombarded. Mariupol appears to be under siege and coming under heavy attack, and its mayor has described it as genocide. In Kiev, the nervous wait continues as a Russian convoy waits on the outskirts of that city. Let's take you through the day's key developments on the ground here, and Ukraine says Mariupol is under pretty constant attack now. The city's mayor says Russia has deliberately cut rail links to prevent civilians evacuating. The city has no water or power supply. To the west is Kherson, which Russia now says is under its complete control, a claim disputed by Ukrainian sources. And close by, there's a battle underway for control of Enerhoda, home to Europe's largest nuclear plant. That's according to the local mayor there. Well, in Chernihiv, Ukraine's emergency services say 22 bodies have been recovered so far after a Russian airstrike hit 2 schools and houses earlier today. In the capital, Kiev, MPs gathered in secret today for just 10 minutes to approve laws allowing the seizure of Russian-owned assets and the right of citizens to bear arms. And in the second city of Kharkiv, well, it's seeing its shelling continue, with much of the centre of the city now reduced to rubble. Alex Rossi has our first report tonight on the battle for the cities.
As this war gets uglier, Russia's tactics are becoming more violent and destructive. This video from Chernihiv shows a missile strike on a residential apartment block. The blast wave shakes the entire city. Whilst the building burns, emergency workers rescue dazed civilians. And the situation in other parts of the country is just as desperate. This is Borodyanka, but as these pictures show, it could just as easily be a suburb in Syria. The damage goes on as far as the eye can see.
What do you want from us? Go away from our land. You don't want to leave now? Sit down with me at the negotiation table. I'm available. Sit with me, but not at 30 meters like you welcomed Macron and Scholz and others. I'm your neighbor. You don't need to keep me at 30-meter distance. I don't bite. I'm a normal man. Sit down with me. Let's talk. What are you afraid of?
On the south coast, Mariupol is now surrounded by Russian forces. There's a constant barrage of artillery smashing into this city on the Sea of Azov. Civilians have been trapped for days, basic essentials running out in many places. The mayor says even those fleeing have come under attack.
They've been shooting at moving vehicles. A humanitarian convoy couldn't even leave the surrounding areas of our town. Today we're in a blockade, and to create tension in the town, they're shooting in the residential areas, targeting civilians, elderly people, children, to create internal panic.
And in some places, Russian troops and tanks are now in control. The man recording these images of the invading force is clearly trapped and very frightened.
I think I should stop recording before someone shoots me on my hand.
The southern port city of Kherson is the first to fall to Vladimir Putin's forces, leaving people fearful about what the violent takeover will mean.
It's very scary because we hear a lot of explosions, especially at night and early in the morning. And we're trying not to leave because I'm here with my grandmother now, and we have enough food for a couple weeks.
Ukraine, though, has no intention of surrender. Even in places that have been overcome, Russian soldiers have been jeered and confronted by ordinary people. In this eastern town, which has supposedly been pacified, a Russian soldier carries 2 grenades after a meeting with the mayor to ensure he's not attacked by the crowds. And despite the intensifying brutality, this is a nation that remains united and defiant. Ukrainian MPs gather to send a message to the Kremlin in parliament.
We had to call to vote for the mobilization, for taking out Russian assets, for bearing arms, for collaborationism, and for informational security, like for many things.
They are singing the national anthem, but their words are being heard far beyond the walls of this chamber. Alex Rossi, Sky News, Eastern Ukraine.
Let me just bring you some breaking news now, and the government has announced sanctions against a couple of Russian oligarchs, Alisher Usmanov and Igor Shuvalov. They include a full asset freeze, a travel ban imposed against Usmanov and Shuvalov, 2 of Russia's leading oligarchs with significant interests in the UK and close links to the Kremlin. Usmanov has had significant interests in English football clubs, Arsenal and Everton. He owns a Beechwood house in Highgate worth an estimated 48 million, and the 16th century Sutton Place estate in Surrey. Shuvalov's assets in the UK include 2 luxury apartments in central London worth an estimated 11 million. He is also a core part of Putin's inner circle and headed up Russia's bid for the 2018 World Cup. Now, as we've been saying, there's been heavy shelling in the strategic port city of Mariupol, which appears now to be encircled with civilians trapped by intense shelling. A 40-mile-long Russian convoy remains on the outskirts of Kiev. Let's get more now on the latest movements of Russian troops and the areas they may be targeting next. Kamali Melbourne was joined by the security and defence analyst Michael Clark.
So, as we know, the Russians are in a number of positions around Ukraine. Just tell us where we are on day 8.
Yes, Kamali. I mean, day 8, it's a two-front war. There is a northern front where the Russians are trying to surround Kiev and move in to actually remove the government, and a southern front where they're going for territory, and eventually those northern and southern fronts, they would hope, will actually link up. There's surrounding cities now. That's the stage we're at. So Chernihiv, Sumy, Kharkiv are all surrounded, as are the big cities in the south.
Yes, it's a fight for the cities in the north, but you mentioned the cities in the south, and as we know, in the past day or so, the city of Kherson in the south has, as we understand it, fallen to the Russians. Just explain to us the importance of these cities. We can see Odessa there, Kherson, Mariupol, these cities for the Ukrainians.
Yeah, 3 big cities in the south. Mariupol should have fallen within hours of the assault beginning. Day 8, there's no water, no electricity. They're still hanging on. I don't know how they're doing it, but they are. Surrounded. Kherson, taken and surrounded. There is still some fighting in Kherson, and Odessa increasingly looks as if it is going to be surrounded. And Odessa, of course, is the port. Taking Odessa, which I'm sure the Russians will try to do, will be economically disastrous for Ukraine.
Yeah, and we have seen some footage coming out from the last couple of hours that shows some ships off the coast of Crimea. Now, what do they tell us about what may well be happening next?
Well, there's more than 30-odd major battleships, Russian battleships, in the Black Sea. At least 7 of them are missile-carrying ships, 3 submarines. But among that group, there are 6 assault ships, 5 standard ones, 1 very big one. Those assault ships normally carry about 12 tanks, maybe 36 armoured personnel carriers, and they carry about 300 troops. So 5 or 6 of those is quite a punch to actually deliver if they're all going to be used together.
In preparation for an amphibious assault?
One would assume an amphibious assault on Odessa is probably the next step.
OK, Michael Clark, thank you very much.
Well, in an address to his Security Council, Vladimir Putin has described Russians and Ukrainians as one people, and he also insisted that his strategy is going to plan. Earlier, his Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov accused America of acting like Napoleon or Hitler and justified the invasion by calling Ukraine's desire to join NATO a threat to Russian security. Meanwhile, the Kremlin continues efforts to suppress dissent, stifling independent journalism and warning people that any unsanctioned protesting could lead to a prison sentence. Moscow correspondent Diana Magnay reports now on the changing nature of Putin's plan.
The funeral of a Russian soldier, one of so many killed during Vladimir Putin's bloody advance through Ukraine.
We all still hope for the better, that everyone starts alive and everyone comes home healthy, alive, back home.
But they won't, because their president is determined to keep on fighting, committed to his own twisted narrative that this is a battle against a neo-Nazi regime, despite the fact that Ukraine's president is Jewish.
I will never go back on the statement that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, even though a lot of Ukrainians have been threatened and brainwashed. We are fighting with the neo-Nazis. They are using civilians as human shields.
Those comments at a meeting with his Security Council, where he held a moment's silence for Russia's dead. It follows a phone call with the French president, which a French presidential source said contained nothing reassuring. Their description of that call is one of the grimmest I've ever read. Vladimir Putin said he was fighting a neo-Nazi regime and that unless diplomatically Ukraine was disarmed and neutralized, he would continue his military campaign. President Macron told him that this was not a Nazi regime, that he was deluded and not describing reality, and that it would cost his country dearly. The source said that Vladimir Putin intended to take the whole country and that the worst was yet to come. But Russia is shrugging off the blame for this war, even as it bans its own media from calling it one.
The thing is, the West is listening to us, but is not hearing us, and it's trying to impose, in every possible way, its understanding of how to live in Europe. This begs comparisons. At the time, Napoleon and Hitler had an objective to have the whole of Europe under their control. Now Americans have the whole of Europe under their control.
Europe is not under America's control, and neither is Ukraine. But those words spring from a mindset deeply held amongst a small group in the Kremlin, which will cost Ukraine, Europe and Russia dearly for a long, long time to come. Diana Magnay, Sky News, Moscow.
Well, now the UN Refugee Agency says the number of people fleeing Ukraine is the fastest exodus seen anywhere in the world this century. The UN says that well over 1 million people have escaped to neighbouring countries since the conflict began, with that number rising by the hour. Some 90,000 have already travelled into Western Europe, but the largest number has crossed the border into Poland. That's more than 550,000. Nearly 140,000 have gone to Hungary, which has changed its hard-line policy on accepting refugees. Moldova, which is not a member of NATO and is nervous it could suffer the same fate as Ukraine, has received nearly 100,000 people. Over 79,000 have crossed into Slovakia, and Romanian authorities have told Sky News today that more than 150,000 people have arrived from Ukraine. Alistair Bunkle reports from the Romanian town of Siret, just south of the Ukrainian border.
The stream of refugees crossing the border now is almost constant, and it's increasing all the time. It is snowing here, it is bitterly cold, but at least it's safe. Almost everyone has left someone behind, decisions they'll never forget.
I leave my family, I leave my mom. Mom was crying and told me that maybe she never see me again. It was most scary words which I heard in my life. I'm still scared. I'm still afraid that I can't see her anymore. I'm left behind all my life. I'm left behind all my dreams.
For a few, there is sheer relief at being reunited with family. Most, though, arrive dazed, unsure of what's next.
I hope we will win soon, the war will end and we come home again.
At the moment, the authorities here are coping. There is enough food, there is enough shelter, there's enough help. But what if the numbers double, triple, quadruple even?
It's fair to say that at the moment, the Romanians have kind of got it sorted. It's a pretty good operation. They move people here as quick as they can do. There's food, there's hot food, drinks for them. They process them, buses, free buses, and then into the local towns and villages. But the numbers are getting more. It was 8% more refugees yesterday than the day before that. And there's already been more today again.
On one side of the border, there are humans killing humans. Just the other side, humans helping humans. There is something quite life-affirming in the way Eastern Europeans are doing everything they can to look after their neighbours. Alistair Bunkle, Sky News, on the Ukrainian-Romanian border.
Deborah Haynes is still with me here in Lviv. So, Deborah, these humanitarian corridors that are being talked about after these talks in Belarus tonight, could they be significant?
I don't think we should read too much into it, because the Ukrainians went into these talks wanting a complete ceasefire. Their cities are being pulverised, and they have been for the last 8 days. Their military has managed to slow the Russian advance, but this is a relentless Russian force, and they have more backup. They clearly have more firepower, and as they are becoming frustrated in terms of the speed of their operation, then they're using more indiscriminate fire, and that's what we're seeing in these cities, such as Mariupol. The mayor today saying that he can't even get the wounded out. So that's why these humanitarian corridors are vital in terms of averting what's already a crisis, but at least trying to rescue some of the civilians. But they're saying there's only the possibility of there being a temporary ceasefire in order to enable that, and then saying that there will be further talks. But in terms of any kind of shining light to see that there might be some hope for some kind of compromise that could end the violence, we're very far from that at the moment.
Right, but a small mercy maybe.
Yes.
And more generally, Vladimir Putin and his state of mind. We've heard from him tonight, national address. We've heard from his spokeswoman tonight. You know, what are you reading into all this?
It's very easy, isn't it, for us, you know, sort of Western countries, which he treats with such disdain, and we view Moscow with such, you know, we view comments from Moscow with such suspicion. There is this huge divide at the moment, and it's becoming entrenched. And the rhetoric, the language coming from the Kremlin, coming from the top, from President Putin, it does not reflect reality. It doesn't matter what kind of West or East position you're in, there is only one reality. And when President Putin goes on television and accuses the President Zelensky of heading some neo-Nazi regime seeking nuclear weapons and holding foreigners hostage and using them as human shields, it's not the reality. When his foreign ministry spokeswoman tells our correspondent Dominic Waghorn that civilian casualties are fake news, that the explosions that you're seeing is fake, it's just not the reality. But
you mentioned the one in Kharkiv specifically, didn't you?
That missile strike, a cruise missile strike on a government building, as Dominic rightly said, that's not a military target, or not an obvious one at least. But this alternate reality that the Russian audience is being fed is very dangerous, because it entrenches those two positions. And in terms of the war, you asked about that with what President Putin was saying. We heard from President Macron today, who had a conversation with the Russian leader, and he was told that the plan is to take the whole of Ukraine.
And there's the worst maybe to come.
Worse to come, and also the fact that President Macron warned President Putin that he was making a major mistake, warned him that the language he was using in terms of describing the Ukrainian government as being neo-Nazi was delusional. And yet there is that huge disconnect. President Putin either believes this fantasy or believes that maintaining this fantasy is sufficient to justify the actions that he's taking. Either way, it's bad news for Ukraine's people and the country as a whole.
Yeah, and it does not bode well. Deborah, thank you very much indeed. Well, what about Ukraine's president? Well, he's challenged the Russian President Putin to sit down for talks while urging the West to offer a stronger military assistance to Ukraine to fight the Russian invasion. Let's hear what he said at a news conference in the capital this afternoon.
Go away from our land. If you don't want to go away, sit down at the table of negotiations. I am available. Sit down, but not 30 meters away like you did with Macron, Scholz, etc. I'm your neighbor. You don't need to keep me 30 meters away from you. I don't bite. I'm a normal man.
Well, NBC's chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel, was at that news conference, and I spoke to him a little earlier.
I was surprised, first of all, that he agreed to have this small gathering with reporters, considering the security constraints that he is under. But he is in Kiev. We met at a government building, and there were probably 15, 20 different journalists in the room. He arrived without a massive security entourage. He did have security with him, but he was carrying his own chair. He put it down in front of the room. He sat down. He appeared calm, relaxed, in good humor. He made some jokes. He did look a little tired. He said he's only been getting a few hours of sleep per night, but he seemed determined to continue to lead this country. He is making a plea for more help. Specifically, he wants a no-fly zone. He emphasized once again that he believes that Vladimir Putin will not stop at Ukraine, that he will continue to go through Eastern Europe, and he said that he will continue his offensive until he reaches the Berlin Wall. So he truly believes that Vladimir Putin is on a mission to relitigate the Cold War with force and with a different outcome for Vladimir Putin. He also mentioned that this country needs more weapons. So he made the appeal for dialogue with Putin, a no-fly zone, and weapons. But he did seem quite calm, and I would say even in good spirits.
NBC's Richard Engel speaking to me a little earlier. This is Sky News Tonight. Coming up, athletes from Russia and Belarus are banned from the Winter Paralympics after protests from other nations at the Games.
I'm Neville Lazarus, and I'm Sky's reporter based in Delhi. We take you to the heart of the story that shapes our world.
The Ukrainian government is confirming that they are now engaged with Russian soldiers. Air raid sirens fill the airways.
In the distance, artillery rains down.
It feels very close to the centre of... There's one.
They found this devastation to their apartment.
Lots of people live here. Quite a few of the windows of the houses have been blown out by the blast.
And it feels that it's changing each day.
Welcome back to Ukraine. Russia has been further excluded from international sport because of its invasion of this country. It will not be allowed to host a Formula One for the foreseeable future. And Russian and Belarusian athletes have been banned from the Winter Paralympics, which start in Beijing tomorrow in a last-minute U-turn. The International Paralympic Committee was heavily criticised when it initially said it would allow the athletes to compete as neutrals. But after a public outcry, it's changed its mind. Our sports correspondent Tom Parminter reports now on pressure at the Paralympics.
Three words that just don't go together: neutral, athlete, Russia. The Paralympic organisers thought that it could work, but almost everyone else here was saying no. The wheelchair curlers from Latvia were among the first to refuse to play the Russians.
You can feel the tension. It's hard to explain, but when you see someone from the Russian Paralympic Committee, you know that there is this war happening, and you know that they probably are not supporting it, but they are not speaking openly about it as well.
With a growing rebellion, the Paralympic organisers had to change their minds. The deaths in Ukraine were staring right at them after a journalist showed them the story of a 19-year-old who competes in biathlon for Ukraine, who was killed this week in the battle for Kharkiv.
At the end of the day, this is not on the IPC. This is on Russia. The IPC shouldn't be having to deal with this. I mean, what country who co-sponsors an Olympic truce bombs everywhere in a massive country?
The Russian Paralympic team said the decision was illegal and wrong. The Ukrainians, who are also here, naturally welcomed it. Some of their 20 athletes and support team had to escape the bombing to reach Beijing.
The front line is back home, and our military are defending this front line from the aggressor, from the invader, but our front, for us, is here in Beijing. This is where we fight at the Paralympic Games.
By removing athletes from Russia and Belarus, these games can at least carry on.
This was, I think, the only decision the IPC could take in terms of allowing
the least amount of friction at the Games. I feel so sorry for the athletes from Belarus and from Russia on a personal level, but what Putin is doing can't go without challenge.
And so these games can at least now get underway. The horror and politics of war will not be forgotten in Beijing, but they won't stop everyone else from taking part. Tom Parmenter, Sky News.
Now, developments in satellite technology mean that the war in Ukraine is visible to millions of people in a way that hasn't been seen before in a global conflict. Images such as the Russian convoy headed for Kiev were first picked up by Google Maps and could be openly viewed, not just by the military, but by ordinary citizens. It means people have access to images beyond the control of governments who maybe want to keep them out of the public eye. Our science correspondent Thomas Moore reports now on how new technology is helping analysis of the conflict from space.
It's satellites that can be as small as a shoebox that are giving us a view of a conflict zone we've never had before. These are nano-satellites being assembled in Glasgow and soon to join a constellation of more than 100 already in orbit, listening in to signals from ships and aircraft. They spotted the Russian Navy in the Black Sea switch off tracking beacons just before the invasion.
So by shrinking satellites down and miniaturizing the technology so these small satellites are more capable, you can deploy them more cost effectively. But what you can also do is deploy many more of them.
Slightly larger commercial satellites are providing the crisp images of convoys, damaged airfields and bombed buildings. Their cameras are so good they can spot objects just 30 centimetres across, even catching a missile being launched. And with so many satellites in orbit, it's possible to monitor the same area several times a day.
The military has had access to that kind of detail for many years, but the Ukraine conflict has launched it into the public domain. Open source intelligence from small satellites is giving us an independent eye on what's going on.
And then once you have training data...
Even an aging satellite owned by the European Space Agency can lead to surprising discoveries.
This general purple background is what we would expect to get back from the satellite. These lighter blue splotches are something on the ground, a military radar most likely, causing interference.
It's a training exercise in Belarus just before the invasion, and the scientist has now written radar detection software so anyone can search images from the Sentinel satellite.
In the conflicts that I've lived through, the invasion of Iraq and all of that, the only imagery that came out of it were the images that were being released by the U.S. Department of Defense, and you just kind of had to take their word for it, Now anyone with an internet connection can check for themselves.
But even if governments can no longer control what we see, the images can still be used to shape public perception.
From a propaganda point of view, NATO could use this and turn around and say, this is what the Russians are doing, specifically to prove that the Russians are not telling the truth about this conflict. By being able to use public available images, they can turn around and say, hey, this is what's happening. You can see it for yourself.
2, 1. But satellites are giving us eyes and ears on parts of Ukraine beyond the reach of TV cameras and civilians with mobile phones. The horror of war is being seen from above. Thomas Moore, Sky News, Glasgow.
This is a Sky News Ukraine invasion special. Coming up, has Britain done enough to seize the wealth of Russian oligarchs? Welcome back to Lviv in Ukraine. 2 Russian oligarchs have tonight been sanctioned by the Foreign Office, restricting their ability to carry out any financial transaction in the UK. They are billionaire Alisher Usmanov, who has links to Everton Football Club, and former Russian Deputy Prime Minister Igor Shuvalov, who was named by Keir Starmer in Parliament yesterday under parliamentary privilege. Well, we're joined now by Dr. Alina Polyakova from the Centre for European Policy Analysis, and also by Misha Glenny, a journalist and author of the Mafia book about Eastern European organised crime. Thank you very much both for being with me this evening. Misha, first of all, are these 2 the sorts of people that the government should be going after?
I think definitely their track record is fairly clear. Both Usmanov and Shuvalov have been closely engaged with Putin for a very long time. It's slightly surprising that it took us this long to get there. Britain appeared to take the lead on engaging with the sanctioning of oligarchs earlier this week, about a week or so ago, and then they started to drag their feet, and the European Union actually took the lead. And of course, yesterday, Usmanov's absolutely extraordinary yacht. I mean, it looks like a cruise liner was seized in Hamburg. So the Germans were on it. And yes, these are the sort of people who are very close to Putin and whose relationship involves not only political engagement, but probably financial engagement as well.
And Anna, a simple question really, does sanctioning oligarchs work? Does it have the desired impact?
Well, I think it depends on what we mean by work. I mean, it's certainly very disruptive to Putin's inner circle. And we have to remember that Russia isn't run like a democratic country like the UK or the United States or others. It's really run by a sort of clan. And some people that belong to that clan are in government, some are outside the government. And certainly they're all intertwined from a financial perspective. And we don't know exactly how. But every time we hit one of these high-level close members that are a deep part of this clan, it will reverberate and have effects on others, including Mr. Putin, most likely. And certainly, I think in the longer term, it may make some of these individuals a bit more reticent about supporting Mr. Putin's policies if he can no longer guarantee their access to their own wealth and their financial assets, which has been the basis really of their support for Mr. Putin for all these years.
Misha, what do you make of Abramovich, the Chelsea owner? You know, he's clearly disposing of his assets there. Will other oligarchs be doing similar things?
Yes, I believe so. And a lot of them will have been working on this for a little time, even before the invasion, I would have thought. I mean, you notice with Abramovich, that he has said that he will give the proceeds of the Chelsea sale to victims of the Ukrainian war. He doesn't say whether they're Russian or Ukrainian victims, but it's a gesture which we're seeing amongst some of the oligarchs who are clearly hedging their bets about what's going to happen in the future. And I think there's an important message here to put across that with all of the sanctions, they don't just hit oligarchs, they're also hitting the Russian people as well, very, very severely already in a short space of time. And I think the message is to send out that these are not designed to hurt the Russian people per se. They are designed to put pressure on the economic and political elite, and particularly those around Putin. And they're 2 different things, because if we accept that this is a highly undemocratic society, and particularly in the last week, I think that Putin has gone full North Korea in many, many respects, including in the media, then we also have to expect that the Russian people don't actually know what's going on really in Ukraine to a large degree. So it is important to target individuals and not to say that we are targeting the Russian people as a whole because they happen to be Russians.
And Dr. Polyakova, why does it, why is it that it seems that sanctioning oligarchs takes such a long time? What is the process that needs to be gone through? And is it, I suppose, part of it is proving, you know, some sort of link to Putin?
Well, it's certainly incredibly complicated. These individuals, of course, don't hold their assets or their money in their own name. There's an incredibly complex system of shell companies and other means of hiding wealth that spreads across their family members, spreads across acquaintances. And it's really uncovering this dark web of corruption that is the key. And that is why I think the White House in the United States, as well as allies, are taking the right step by establishing a task force to be able to track down and enforce these sanctions, not just on these individuals, but what's really important here, I think, and was actually quite new in this round of sanctions than what we've seen previously, is that they are also targeting close family members. Of course, these people have property all over the world. They have it in all kinds of hidden offshore accounts. And I think we have to aggressively track these down, shut them down, so they start to hit really hard, these individuals at home. And certainly there will be effects from broader sanctions, not these sanctions, on the Russian people. But I think what's really interesting to watch now is that most of the effects are now happening from companies, American companies, UK companies, European companies, from pulling out of the Russian market, even though they are not being forced to, but the sanctions regime is making it difficult for them to operate there. And just today we saw a run on IKEA happening in St. Petersburg because IKEA announced it will no longer operate in Russia. So I think these kinds of second-tier effects are actually what's needed to start to really make it clear to the Russian people that their government has been lying to them, and that they, unfortunately, are going to have to bear some of those costs because of the Kremlin's brutal war against Ukraine.
Right, and Misha, what about these, you know, wealthy Russians who are giving money to the Conservative Party? I mean, not necessarily would they have close connections to Putin, I suppose?
No, not necessarily, but you have to understand why this this sort of environment has emerged in the first place. And that's why it's really important when we do this is not just to target Russians, but to target the mechanisms which successive British governments have actually facilitated so that people from all over the world can turn London into the money laundering capital of the world. And with regards to the Tory party, I think we should really start to scrutinize where the wealth of those people who donated to the Tory party actually came from. If you look, for example, at Yevgeny Lebedev, who was ennobled, of course, by Boris Johnson, despite the House of Lords Appointments Committee arguing against that that ennoblement because of this was after they'd received information from MI6 about Lebedev, is you know, are we looking at money that was made legitimately in the 1990s by his father? Or was there some dodgy stuff in operation there? We have to look at all this stuff. If you look at the House of Commons Select Committee from 2018 on security and intelligence, the report on Russia that Boris Johnson tried to kick in the long grass and postpone its publication until after the election in 2019. If you look at that, there are two clear messages that came out of that. First of all, the Tories receive a lot of money from Russians. Secondly, the House of Commons Select Committee believed there was sufficient evidence to examine what the Russian involvement in the Brexit referendum of 2016 was. So there are all sorts of questions which emerge out of this. Whether they're actually going to be examined properly, I don't know. I don't hold out a huge amount of hope.
Okay, and just finally, Dr. Polyakova, you think, I was reading earlier today, that you think that institutions, like museums and so forth, need to be careful about accepting money from oligarchs going forward.
Absolutely. You know, we have seen this pattern emerge of the last 20 years where these Russian oligarchs who are getting wealthy by stealing from the Russian people through corruption are whitewashing their reputations by being listed on the boards of trustees of incredibly prestigious cultural institutions, the Guggenheim being one, but many, many others. And maybe there was an excuse for that 20 years ago, 15 years ago, when we didn't really know the true nature of the regime. These individuals looked like maybe legitimate businessmen. But now that we have a war in Europe, a completely unprovoked aggression from Russia, every one of these oligarchs has been complacent in this war. All of their businesses and all their wealth begotten in all kinds of corrupt ways has been supporting this regime. So I think now is the time to offload this money by nonprofit institutions or cultural institutions to send a clear message of no more, because the picture is a little too crystal clear now. And frankly, I don't think you want to be in a position as one of these highbrow cultural institutions where suddenly you find yourself listing on your board of trustees someone who's been sanctioned by the United States or the UK or Europe. Yeah. I mean, there's a huge reputational risk there, and I don't think it's worth it.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Dr. Polyakova and also Misha Glenny, thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
Right, this is a Sky News Ukraine special. Coming up, the UK launches a massive aid appeal to help the Ukrainian people.
I'm David Blevins, and I'm Sky's senior Ireland correspondent. I'm based in Belfast, a city transformed by peace, but still struggling with its past. Politically, the two sides are as far apart as ever, and it's over that question of who has sovereignty in Northern Ireland, the very issue that's been the source of tension here for generations.
It takes 60 minutes to cross the Irish Sea. It took the British monarchy a century.
I've spent 25 years reporting the journey from conflict to peace.
The political parties of Northern Ireland have reached agreement.
We help you understand the world with us.
Today, we have reached an agreement with the Conservative Party on support for government in Parliament.
We already know what the government gets out of this deal. What exactly does the DUP get out of it? Well, £1.5 billion. Welcome to Winterfell. It's an iconic location in this globally acclaimed drama.
Ophelia was the most powerful hurricane this far east in the Atlantic on record.
You can't live in a place like this and not appreciate the environment.
Welcome back to Ukraine. A national fundraising campaign has been launched tonight to help this country. The Disasters Emergency Committee is appealing for funds to help people affected by this conflict. Already the government has donated some medical equipment and other humanitarian supplies. Another plane carrying tons of aid left Stansted Airport near London earlier today. Well, tonight's appeal is led by the Disaster Emergency Committee. The government says it will match every donation up to a total of £20 million. We're joined now by the Chief Executive of the Disasters Emergency Committee, Salah Saeed. Thank you very much for joining us. And as we've been seeing on Sky News all day, the need is really very, very acute now.
Indeed it is, Mark, and we've seen the news today that 1 million people have sadly fled the conflict in Ukraine, across the borders into neighbouring countries such as Poland and Romania. And the needs, as your programme has already highlighted, are immense. People leaving their homes, their livelihoods, their jobs, and often their families behind. And the pictures are showing now the kind of scale that we're having to deal with. And the DEC, the Disasters Emergency Committee, launched its appeal today, united with its 15 member charities, both working directly on the ground and through local partners. And of course, we must also credit and acknowledge the wonderful work that local volunteers and the Ukrainian charities, and of course the charities on the border as well, are responding as the first responders, and our member charities and their local partners are working alongside them to make sure that we reach as many people as possible. That's why the DEC has launched the appeal today.
And I was going to ask you about what you were just talking about. I mean, how easy is it, or perhaps I should say, how difficult is it to get aid into Ukraine on the ground now? Must be very difficult.
The logistics of working in a war zone is always difficult and challenging. And of course, there are considerations for the safety of aid workers and civilians for that matter as well. But we are working with the 13 leading international aid organizations who are used to working in conflict zones, in war zones, and have appropriate systems and protocols in place to make sure both the safety of their aid workers and their volunteers. The real challenge is, of course, the scale of the need and making sure that there is sufficient funds in order to meet that need. The United Nations has estimated that it needs $1.5 billion in order to meet that humanitarian response. And we're incredibly grateful to the UK public who, in that first day of the appeal, are already responding hugely generously by donating on our phones, on our website. And we, of course, urge people to continue to support the appeal so that we can reach even more people in Ukraine and in surrounding countries.
And most of this aid will be focused, will it, on those countries who are receiving most of these people?
That's correct, both for those displaced inside Ukraine, and the concern now is that up to 7 million people will eventually, sadly, be displaced in Ukraine if this crisis continues. And up to 4 million people could flee Ukraine into neighbouring countries and beyond. The DEC appeal will target and help the most vulnerable communities, in particular women and children, who seem to be the worst affected by this crisis, both inside Ukraine and in those surrounding countries.
OK, Salah Saeed of the Disasters Emergency Committee, thank you very much indeed for being with us, and good luck with the appeal.
Thank you.
Right, it has been day 8 of the invasion here, another violent day. Coming up next in the next hour, the latest from here as President Putin says his special operation, his special military operation is going to plan.